right. So I'm going to talk about, I do not need, do you see my,
We see like the presenter's view.
okay, I don't need presenter view. We can just do this. So I want to talk about how to build a research agenda one limitation at a time. Um, as I was talking with the PIs of the various training grants and what we may want to make sure that you are supported with or content that you may be interested in right now. One of the things that we talked about was thinking about how you go from where you are right now to maybe where you want to be. And especially where you want to be is a tenured or tenure track professor or research faculty at a research university. Being very aware that that might not be where everybody wants to be. But one of my goals as a mentor is to make sure that you have the knowledge and skills to go wherever you want. And so today's going to be a lot about me, but my journey and sort of what I did to get where I am, so to be transparent and show that it doesn't start with having just walking right into multi-million-dollar grants and sort of the infrastructure and some of the habits that I developed and learned and lessons learned along the way, both as sort of professional dispositions, but then also letting research lead you to the next step. So I want to start out, oops, I took away my slides. So I want to start out with like where I came from. So like some of you, I know we have people coming from various backgrounds. And like some of you, I came out of the classroom into a doctoral program. So I was a middle school special ed teacher, and I had a variety of experiences in that role. And those were really my why. Those were my why behind leaving the classroom to become a teacher of teachers. I did my master's degree while teaching and did a thesis and really loved research. I had the privilege of working with Linda Meckling during my undergraduate degree and doing research then. So you'll see I highly value involving students in research for that reason. And I wasn't at R1, I was at a small teaching program. And so all of these experiences that I enjoyed, they were my why, right? They helped me see the current problems in the field, what students were able to do, what I wish I knew better, how to better support them, and made me want to become a teacher of teachers. But then you transition into a doctoral program, right? And so you have what your perspective is as a special ed teacher, which is very valid. And those are important experiences to have. And so whether you were a speech language pathologist or a psychologist, or you had other practical experiences relevant to your degree program, you have those experiences. And part of the growth in a doctoral program is how to broaden your view and keep connected to your why, but be willing to be flexible and see that there's more and other things that are relevant to helping to solve those problems. And so that's a journey. I like to say it's going from this like street level view to a Google Earth view, right? And being able to take that bigger perspective, which there's some cognitive dissonance that happens, and that's sort of a normal journey to take. So I had to make sure that I was working smarter, not harder, as a doc student. And so there were three things that I did that I would recommend. One, when you come in, that I joined my advisor's research. So I was really fortunate. I went to UNC Charlotte and worked with Diane Browder, who had I joined her near the end of her research career. I didn't know it was the end, that I was her final doctoral student, and she's now fully retired. But I joined into what her line of research was, and I'll show you in a minute sort of what that journey was like. And so I came into that looking at, what are my interests and where is her expertise? And even if every project I join isn't like 100% right in what I'm interested in, what can I always be gleaning from whatever project or opportunity I'm given? And then two, I had a graduate assistantship on a IES grant, and I was I'm very glad that I was there from year one, so that I could see what that process was like. And I used that to gain experience and expertise in research and project management. It happened to become my area of um, research interest. But even if it hadn't, I saw that from the more senior doc students who were working on grants that maybe weren't like directly what they were going to be doing, but we can always be gathering skills and sort of embedding our interests or finding ways that it relates. And then I always wanted to leverage coursework to build my knowledge base, to know how to situate my research agenda, and if possible, get publications or get presentations or connections out of that. Something I did not do in my master's, because I didn't know any better, nobody told me, was to kind of keep an interest and build around that as possible. I think in every class I researched something totally different, so I felt like I was starting from scratch. Now it's nice because I know a little bit about a lot of things, but in a doctoral program at some point you kind of need to funnel. And so I tried to leverage that coursework. So I'll show you some ways that I did that. So I wanted to always align my time with my goals. And when my goal, I knew pretty early on, was to get a tenure track position. I knew that I wanted it to be at a research intensive university. That was my first goal. And so I established and kept regular hours, regular GA hours, regular time for research and writing and homework, so that I viewed my job as a job. And I saw myself as a junior colleague, as a professional in that environment versus like as a student. It's a weird dynamic that you go into. I protected my writing time and viewed it as a discipline to develop, but I was joining a place where that was the culture. My advisor was basically unreachable on Wednesdays unless it was an emergency, because that was her day. She was a like write all day person. We had other faculty that we worked with that we knew, they write every day from 8 to 11. And so talking about your writing time and protecting your writing time was a part of the culture. And then I found role models, both my, within the doctoral program, others through professional organizations. And then I looked at other early career people and looked at their CVs and looked at what they had achieved and said, here's what they've done. How can I kind of see what are their habits? How can I get to know them and find out what systems worked for me? I do want to be very clear that I was married, but I did not have children. And so I had some financial privilege. If my husband worked full time, he was a teacher. So like, there's that. And I had a graduate assistant position. And so I know, depending on your caretaking responsibilities, this varies, but you need to find the system that works for you. So then I did get a faculty position straight out of my doctoral program. So I didn't do any type of postdoc. And there's another transition. So you have your perspective as a practitioner, and then you have your perspective as a doc student. And then you have a similar perspective change as a faculty member, both in like the roles and responsibilities of what your job is, and that very much how great the difference is between these circles also depends on your training program and the experiences you had as a doc student, as far as how much you're aware of what faculty life is. And then there's going to be differences between wherever you got your training and wherever you're going. And differences are okay. Differences aren't bad necessarily. But I think that I personally wasn't aware of quite what all of those would be. But that's a transition to prepare for, and a transition to be aware of as a, thinking, those of you who've begun and thought about what emotionally, physically, for your family, for your relationships, has that change been like from a practitioner or whatever you were doing before into a doctoral program? And then it's even more so as a faculty member, especially if you're thinking about involves moving and different aspects. And so you have to consider that and set yourself up for success as you're launching your independent research career as a new faculty member. So I really wanted to align my time with my goals as a tenure track faculty member at an R1. And I was tenure track, and it's a research university. And that means that my goal is to get tenure. And that's where the majority of my time needed to be aligned. But also I had personal goals. So I started um, my son, when I interviewed at Florida State, I was 5.5 or 6 months pregnant. I had my son I defended my dissertation in January, and I had my son in April, and we moved here in August, right? So I needed to start this position. It was a lot of life changes in one year. Yeah, you do what you got to do. And I started this position with a baby. And so I knew that we have lots of priorities. So again, with this time management of making sure that I'm establishing and keeping a regular schedule for writing, course preparation stays in its bucket, and you only give it as much time as you allow it there. Project meetings, systematizing things, and again, viewing my writing time as a discipline to develop. And again, I found role models, studied their choices and habits, tried to find out what systems work for me, and took advantage of all the university resources and supports. And I think that graduate students at Florida State have way more resources and supports than I had as a doctoral student at UNC Charlotte. So I think that you likely will already know all the things that I had to sort of learn in my first couple of years. And then I knew that we wanted more children. Not anymore, we're all done. So I had another child in my 4th year. So before I had tenure. So just to give a perspective on what those priorities were just in my first 2 years, and like, what did that look like? What resources did I have? In my first year, I really wanted to establish a lab to systematize things. I wanted to publish my dissertation. Again, set yourself up for success. It's the first, that's one thing you can get out. And depending on the format for your dissertation, you can get several things from there. I was coming off of this large grant. I wanted to publish that data. That's with the team though. And sometimes all of our timelines don't line up. I wanted to conduct a replication of my dissertation. So I had already had a plan for that based on my limitations. So I could go ahead and make a plan for how to replicate it. I wanted to apply for internal grants and attend this. I'm going to use this acronym quite a few times. So if you're not familiar, this is the IES, Institute for Education Sciences, Single Case Research Design Institute. So that's the methodology I primarily use. And I knew that I really, really wanted to get into that institute, something you have to apply for, and then you attend over the summer. So I came in with no grants. I had just come out of a doctoral program. I did apply for an internal grant that gave me $16,000 in summer salary. So I did not teach over the summer that first year. I had $1,600 for travel. That's it. That does not go very far. I had 3 GAs. 2 were doctoral students for 10 hours a week, and then 1 was a master's student. But when you have brand new research assistants, it takes a lot and a long time to build all of that up. 2 undergrad research assistants, and then I taught a 1-2. So I had 1 class in the fall, 2 classes in the spring. Year 2, I wanted to publish that replication I did, keep publishing on the grant that was wrapping up, publish the data from that internal grant that I had. Again, continuing to establish relationships. That's a goal every single year. Can never be done having relationships with schools. I really wanted to dive into learning more about grant mechanisms and applying for grants. Again, those are like that's on the to-do list at all times. I, at this point, still had no grant funding, just $1,600 in my travel funds. I had the same GAs, which is so very helpful, and 2 new undergraduate assistants. And again, I had only a 1 course buyout, so I had a 2-1 that year. And I taught 2 summer courses because I needed the salary over the summer. So faculty are I'm on a 9-month contract, so I'm paid 9 months out of the year, fall and spring semester, and there's no salary over summer. And because we had a young son, my husband stayed home. We chose for him to be a stay-at-home parent. And so I really needed that summer salary. And so in the midst of conducting the research, I also was, and writing grants, I was also teaching 2 courses. So now I want to stop there and see if anyone has any questions before me move you guys back over here. Before I kind of walk you through my research limitations, my breadcrumbs. You can also feel free to put them in the chat as I go along. There's really no off-limit questions. I'm trying to be really, those who my students know, I try to be really transparent. I
had a question.
Yeah.
I was curious, is there anything you wish you did your first year that you didn't do that would have made your first year in transition to research easier?
That's a really good question. In some ways, I wish I would have just read more broadly. So I read, I mean, you read like a lot, right? So I read for my classes, and I read my advisor's research, and especially as I show you the research I joined. But I wish that when I was reading those, I had like gone out, right? So here's what we're doing, and asking more questions of why and what happened before that, and why are you making this choice? Because when you join established research teams, depending on the leadership and communication style, we're making a lot of choices using a lot of acronyms that are being done for a reason. But I wish I would have read more and asked more of like, why are we doing this? And I feel like I just had to figure it out. Luckily, that only was for the first 2 studies I was on. Later, I was at the very beginning. So I knew why, because I was a part of that. That's a good question. Anne asked, how do I plan for my annual goals? I plan by semester. So I do planning every beginning of every semester, and I use the NCFDD. I'll put it into the chat. Oh, well, of course, I wish I was there. So that was the first year of my docs program, and I wish Stacy Harden had been with me every step of every way of my journey. NCFDD core curriculum. You all have access to that as FSU students, and I wish that I had done. I do every semester has a plan webinar at the beginning of every semester, and it helps me to plan out my like what are the big goals I have, break it down into the steps, and then you align that with your calendar. It never, ever goes as planned, but at least I have a plan. So how similar was your first year experience to those in your cohort who went to other universities? As far as my first year in as a faculty member, it was very different because we went to very different universities. My cohort ended up being very diverse. One now works in a institution is not the right word, but basically a mental hospital with adults who have significant self-injurious behaviors and mental health concerns. A second runs a school for students with significant behavioral concerns. A third is a newly tenured professor at University of Memphis, and then myself. So there were just 4 of us in our cohorts. We were a small group. And I think because I was the only one going into a research intensive position, it was very different. My friend who went to Memphis does, I think, a lot more program coordination and a lot more like paperwork for accreditation and working with student teachers and that type of stuff, whereas my focus has been more on research. All right, I'm going to share this screen and move it over here. All right, so taking just a second to get it. All right, so I've got this kind of in buckets to walk you through like the journey of my CV, right? So sometimes you look at people's CVs and you're like, how did they get like from one thing to another? And I want to show you kind of the story behind it. Oh, it says my screen sharing is paused. Okay, now you can see it. So joining, when you first come in, like you do what you're asked to do, right? And then you take the opportunities that you're given. This is my advice. You do what you're asked to do and you take the opportunities that you're given. So I joined my advisor's research. Her area really was general curriculum access for students with moderate to severe disabilities. We sat down my first week and she said, you're going to do a single case study this year. I want it to be related to comprehension with system release prompts and story elements. What are you interested in? And I said, well, I'm really interested in how graphic organizers can support comprehension using technology and autism. And so here's what we came up with, the study. At the same time, my friend Karen, who was 1 year above me, so like my big sister, she was doing her second year studies, the way we termed it. And so she was doing something very similar. It was comprehension, system of least prompts. They were working on WH words. And I was like, oh, well, I'm really interested in, again, how can we bring in graphic organizers here? Technology, it's still students with autism. So we collaborated. And then what was really cool is we ended up doing these in the same classroom at the same time. So we found one teacher and we were two of their literacy centers and they would rotate. And we took the kids, I think there were like 8 kids in the class and half of them participated in her study and half of them participated in mine. And we rotated around. So that was really cool. So she did my IOA, my inter observer agreement and procedural fidelity, and I did hers. Because if you're not familiar with single case research, it's a repeated measure. So you have to have a dependent variable that you can measure every single session. And so in that case, it was comprehension for each of us, and then a vocabulary measure. And then you have to have someone do inter-observer agreement for at least 30% of the sessions in each phase for each student, and procedural fidelity. So it's much easier to just, we're both there. So that was cool. And gave me, experience in doing this type of intervention work. And then I have here, I'm going to share this document with you all. And then she gave me a lot of textbook different chapter writing opportunities, which were important because they gave me things like opportunities to write contribute to major textbooks in the field, chapter writing experience, which is a very different type of writing, and deepening my expertise in assessment, for example, which is, in my field, like you have to be pretty fluent in that. For me. And then when it came time, this was in the 8th edition, when it came time for the 9th edition, and she had retired, the editors then asked me to write the lead chapter. And I'm just waiting for, I bet the 10th edition will be soon. Then same thing, deepening my chapter writing expertise in assessment. And then I started to become, again, had this real interest in how to use technology for instruction. So chapters give you the opportunity to, sometimes if I might be doing coursework that has things related to, you get to pick a topic you want to write on. Let me go ahead and write on or read about technology for instruction for this population. So I'm growing my research base. I'm becoming familiar with that literature. What journals is it in? Who are the authors? How has this progressed? Because special ed is a very young field. Access to the general curriculum is 20 years old, 25 years old at most, and technology is rapidly changing. So I need to kind of know who did what and led to what to be well versed. And similarly, she gave me great writing opportunities with well-known people in the field, so that gave me exposure. And then that led to things like conference presentations with those people, who then that leads to, getting to know other folks. And so those were, I did not realize at the time the value of those opportunities. And so if your advisors ask you to do things like that, there's value in it. Another example of leveraging my doctoral coursework was in our single case design class. We had to conduct an evidence-based practice review as a whole class. There were only like 7 people in the class. And then So that was interesting, and having to work in a group of 7 to we had to write a manuscript length article in 2.5 weeks. So that was stressful. But afterwards, 4 of us decided to pursue it for publication, right? So I was like, we've done all this work. Like, let's just do the extra, take it the extra mile to get it published. That also, you have to know when to do, when something's good enough, but then also know like when to do a good job on it. So maybe you can get more out of it, right? So then I told you, as a graduate assistant, I was on an IES Goal 2 grant. Block this. And that grant was called the Solutions Project. What the Solutions Project did was, it was Goal 2 is a research and development. So we're developing an intervention and testing it. It's not really a scale up thing. And the purpose was to develop a problem solving intervention and assessment for students with moderate to severe intellectual disabilities and autism who also have an intellectual disability. Prior to this work, there had been only one study that only had one participant with a moderate intellectual disability and taught them to solve word problems. So this was brand new. So that was really cool to be kind of on the ground floor and see how we were building this intervention. So Alicia Saunders' dissertation was the first experimental study, and that was our first year, and I did her inter-observer agreement, procedural fidelity. That means I went with her 2 or 3 days a week and sat next to her and watched and learned and problem solved and talked. And I was there seeing how the students were responding. We taught group and change. There are 3 problem types in this curriculum we were developing. She taught 2 of them and did a generalization measure, but the students really struggled with that second problem type. And also it was done just one-on-one with a researcher and a student. So then the next year, I told my advisor, I was like, I did the literacy stuff my first year, joining into what they already had planned, but now I really think that I want to focus on math. And so we kind of made that shift and decided that math was going to be my area of expertise. And so we had already done studies on 2 of the problem types. Now we were going to see how our intervention worked with the third. And this was my first author study. We taught just that one problem type, but we used a pretty complex single case design. I'm really proud of the study. I present on it a lot. It has a lot of limitations, but they all do. The ones I'm pointing out to you are, there was a measurement limitation. We only taught one problem type. There was no generalization. And it was taught, again, a one-on-one setting with a researcher, which is really common and important when you are first developing an intervention, especially when this has never been done before. And so you want to be the one tailoring things, but it's something that needs to be addressed. So then we had in the next year, we had the full curriculum developed. We had been piloting it in non-experimental studies with teachers, and now we're ready to scale up. Scale up in a single case way. So I was led the data management and scheduling for the single case design. And so that was a great experience for me to see. You have all these people, all these schools to get to, managing the data, making sure other people are coding the data correctly and getting it in. And again, if you're not familiar with single case design, we make response guided decisions. So you're looking at the data every single day that it's brought in to decide what to do next and who gets what intervention when. So we had, this time it was not one-on-one. We had special ed teachers that taught all 3 problem types, and they taught them in small groups. And they were able to generalize their problem solving skills from a paper and pencil intervention to the smartboard and video-based problems. The limitations, though, were that the teachers needed a lot of support. We were in their classrooms every day, kind of side-by-side teaching a lot. So it's not super realistic. Also, the quantities All the problems only had numbers 1 through 10. Again, was just the beginning of this intervention, and these students had never solved any type of problem before. And we only taught the additive problems, those 3 problem types. That then led into my dissertation, where I wanted to vary the problem type and wanted to get into algebra for middle school students. I wanted to use technology. So I put the task analysis that they were using onto an iPad to increase their independence. Limitation was the technology I chose sucked, and it kept freezing and not working, and the students would get really frustrated and not use it. But it was obviously publishable still, so it wasn't that bad. And mixed generalization. They didn't do a great job of generalizing. And so I was like curious as to why. What was it about my instruction that prevented generalization? And then also that year, I had the opportunity to lead another doc student's research, right? So one way to help build some of your skills that you're going to be expected to have as a faculty member is to see if you can help mentor some more junior doctoral students in their research. And so Chelsea Brosh, this was her first year, and she was interested in this area also. And so we taught one of the problem types, change. We related it to taught students how to solve problems related to leaving a tip and an item being on sale. And we taught them to use a calculator. So we used larger quantities, generalized across calculators. That was one. And then the sort of the final 2 things that I did that actually I worked on once I came to be a faculty member, those wrapping up solutions writing tasks, was an updated evidence-based practice review. So if I'm diving into the math research so deeply, but there hasn't been a review or meta-analysis focused on this published since 2006, 5 or 6. So we did this update to a foundational review. We did not do a meta-analysis. We just did the evidence-based practice review. But it broadly focused on all areas of mathematics, wasn't specific to any one type. Which wasn't that hard because there's not that much research on math for this population, so it was okay to be that broad. And the final sort of wrap up with solutions was a conceptual paper. So we were invited for a special issue of RPSD on teaching, at that point, Common Core mathematics. And so we published the guidelines for writing word problems and published our conceptual model for MSBI. But it was only the initial studies to build on. Now looking back, it feels a little premature that we did that. In some ways, as far as the conceptual model, or maybe not premature, maybe I just want to like a part 2, like we've learned some other things still to add on to that. All right, so then as I transitioned into becoming a faculty member, I really wanted to build an evidence base for MSBI. That's the name of the intervention, modified schema-based instruction, because I saw amazing things that students could do, but we had done so little. If we had just taught 3 problem types, and there's so much more to math than what we had done. I felt like it was a publishable and a fundable area. So that's a good place to stake your claim for tenure. So my first year, I did a single case design replication of my research, of my dissertation. Building on those prior limitations, I used a different teaching sequence and the students were able to generalize better. I also used larger quantities because these students knew their math facts. And so I didn't have to use manipulatives, but still one-on-one with researchers. At this point, when you're coming into a new place, I wasn't even going to try to get a teacher to implement an intervention. I was just like, hey, can I come and like work with your tutor, your students in math? Can I come pull them and work with them one-on-one? And I even went to a private school here. That was easier to get into than the public schools. I also continued supporting Chelsea Brosh, that doc student at UNC Charlotte. So I continued to support her when I moved here, as she wanted to continue working in this area. And we taught, since word problems involve text, she wanted to see at the same time as we taught problem solving, could we teach, these were early elementary students with moderate intellectual disabilities, could we teach them nouns and verbs? We did, so that was cool. But still, one-on-one with researchers, only one problem type. I guess goes on. And so then with that first grant that I got from FSU that supported my summer salary, I decided to try and up the ante on the types of math that we were teaching these students. So I'd done a lot of like, okay, they can add and subtract with these simple problems. So we wanted to see, could they do data analysis? So word problems required them to refer to scaled pictographs. So these are like, if we have a bar, it looks like a bar chart, but the pictograph that has, how many cars were sold different days of the week, right? It had like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and it would say like each car picture equals 5 cars, right? So they wouldn't just have to count the cars, they would have to count, there were 3 cars on Monday and they'd have to do 3 times 5 or skip count. So it was multiple step problems. They'd have to refer to the pictographs to solve them, multiple step, and they were able to generalize when we removed the supports. It was one-to-one with researchers because we did this during the summer. And again, only one problem type. But the students shocked me, which is a common theme of what I've learned over and over, that it's not about what the students are able to do, it's about what we can figure out how to teach them. And so then I have what I call my mother study of what launched my pivot away from what I had learned and what was really coming out of the grant that I worked on as a doc student, and what helped to launch me as an independent researcher. Which everyone needs, you have to make that turn in some way. Even if you're still collaborating with each other, you kind of have to have your own thing. And I got an invitation from Peggy King Sears, who's at George Mason, on to conduct a study. So normally when you get invitations for special issues, they're like, do you have anything in hand, or do you have anything already written or about to be written on this topic? And it's often a relatively short turnaround. This was very different. She said, I want you to conduct a study on this, and I'm going to give you 2 years, a year and a half. So we talked in March, and she said, this won't be due until the following August. So I want you to plan a study on UDL to teach, she knew for me, math to students with more extensive support needs. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense. And it really made me look at MSBI, this intervention, in a whole different light, and what additional supports can we give students. And so it's funny, is this was the first one, but it was the last to be published in a series of things because of the way things go. And this is when Deidre joined my team as a master's student. So we had a whole new things that we added to our intervention, which you're not in this area, so the specifics don't matter. But we started teaching new problem types. So we're going to percent of change. It's multiple steps. We're not just adding and subtracting. We're working with more complex math. We're using technology with built-in supports. We're focusing on the UDL framework, using complex single case designs. So that was all great. But I was a little bit unsure of their actual conceptual understanding of what percent means, still one-on-one with a researcher. It is really hard to get teachers to implement interventions until you have a lot of money. And you need pilot data to show that your ideas are worth funding. And math is so new that I needed a lot of data, and it takes a lot of convincing that these students should even be taught math. I could do a whole other talk on that. I am next week at Acres. So at the same time, I got another invitation for a special issue. These are awesome because it's like a fast track to publication. And so at the same time we did the UDL study, we call it, we did another one because I was like, we already have all these materials. I'm getting more GAs working with me. So let's just do another one at the same time. We didn't have as much time, so we only did one problem type. We only did sale. And we wanted to see if they could determine if they had enough money once they calculated the final price after using a coupon. But our measurement of that was really not good because we just had them answer yes or no. Would you have enough money? And so with no like rationale or why. So we really didn't know if they really knew what they were doing. So then the teacher from the UDL study, the next school year, emails and said, hey, can you come back and like do more with us? And you never ever say no to that. So I came to the lab meeting and was like, hey, what should we do? And I'm really getting hot on systematic replications at this point. So we said, let's replicate the coupon study. That measurement was so faulty. Instead, we taught them the next dollar rule to show us how much money they would need once they found this final price. And so that was neat. And then we have Deidre's thesis, which she did right before she left us to go to Spain. And here again, we're working in the multiplication round. We've done so much percent of change. She took us to multiplicative comparison with a new problem type, working with young adults. I think they were all 21 at a transition program. And then she introduced this 2-column task analysis. So the students were self-monitoring if they were not just completion. We've always had self-monitoring completion, but accuracy. Are they doing things by themselves or with help? And as soon as she suggested that, I was like, duh, why haven't we been doing that this whole time? That's brilliant. Of course we should be doing that. And she also had them generalized to a real world activity. So she really pushed our thoughts on generalization and self-monitoring. And then I had this, at the same time all this is happening, I'm going to Hawaii for a conference, and a teacher from Australia comes to a session and she says, I want you to do research in my classroom. Like she said, I've read some of your MSBI stuff. I've tried to implement it. So I came to your session to hear you explain it. Can we collaborate? And I was like, well, yes. If a teacher comes to you as a willing participant, you never say no, even if it means you have to have research meetings at like 9 at night because of the time zone difference. And so Bree Jimenez, also my colleague, was in Australia at the time. So she was able to help do some of the fidelity work. But it was teacher implementation finally in small groups. And we did maintenance, which is also really hard to get. We had maintenance like 6 weeks later, but because their school year is a different timing than ours, it worked out. And we tried out using like pure explicit instruction versus system of least prompts, and it worked. I was very hesitant, but the teacher was the one she was great to quickly say, like, yeah, system of least prompts not going to work. It's not going to work for me. I can't do that in a small group. That's not feasible. Let's try this instead. And she was right, and it worked. So then I'm just going to mention Sarah Cox's work. I'm not going to bring on the limitations of that, but that's what she has been able to establish herself as an independent researcher. So aligned with my work, but she's really established that she works with using MSBI with students with autism who don't have intellectual disability. So these students are in the gen ed classroom. And so when we think about, right, this instructional strategy works for students who have extensive support needs. What about the students with autism who don't? What aspects of MSBI do we need to keep and let go of? And so she had some innovative research designs to use for that, new ways of measuring, and trying new problem types. And she got a Organization for Autism Research graduate student grant to conduct 3 studies. or she used it to support 3 studies. One of these was her prelim. I can't remember which. And then her dissertation, which was just published in Exceptional Children. And so she really helped to pilot some of these multiplicative problem types. So we then go over to, I finally got an external grant. Yay. So all of that was done with no external funding, just internal and being scrappy. So I got a grant from the Organization for Autism Research, and then it was kind of topped up with some internal funding from the college and university, where we wanted to use augmented reality to teach math, because we were trying to teach both the social and mathematical problem solving skills. What we learned from the UDL and the coupon studies was, yeah, the students now know like the procedures of how to calculate a tip and how to find things on sale. But when you go to actually do that, it takes more than just the math. And it was a doc student, Nanette Hammonds, was talking about her high school son about they were buying something and the receipt was wrong. And he didn't notice until after. And then he didn't want to go up and say anything. He didn't know what to say. And I was like, oh, and he's typically developing. So what about our students with autism or other developmental disabilities? And so we decided to target both the math problem solving and the social problem solving aspects of personal finance. And so we did 2 studies. One was at with older, like 21-year-olds. We had them using multiple apps, and we were so worried, like, this is too many apps. They're not gonna be able to go between apps. Yes, they had no problem. They were fine with that. And a performance-based generalization where we saw if they could apply it at their school's snack shop, but just once at the end. And then we have this paper that Sarah emailed me about today that we're working on, where we did a replication with high school students, and we had very different findings. It was still effective, but they needed a lot more support. The other thing we did with the augmented reality was see if the students could check their work based on video. So could they look at the video, look at their work, and judge it for accuracy? And the 21-year-olds, not really a problem. The high schoolers, more difficult. You have to be watching the video to check your work. So we needed to like support and teach and reinforce those attending skills. But so we have all that going on, and then I get an IES Early Career Award. So this is all building up this pilot data. It's showing the need, the ability of students, but then showing like, I need money and support to be able to have teachers implement, because what I now know is it's not about what students can do necessarily. It's about supporting the teachers to be able to teach in small groups. It doesn't really matter what I, as a researcher, or my awesome graduate assistants can come in and do. Anybody can pull a kid and work one-on-one. I want to know what works in a like real classroom setting. And so we had our first year study. Addie had joined us by this point, and Sarah was a postdoc. Teacher implemented in small groups, and then COVID happened. We did get enough for publishable data, but we didn't get maintenance or generalization. And the teachers needed a lot of support, a lot. But we had to pivot because COVID happened. So we got, I wrote a AERA grant with Taryn Wade and Sarah Cox and Addie McConnelly. And then I also got an Autism Science Foundation grant to see how we could teach the math skills, basically exactly what I was doing with teachers. How could we do that with parents? Because parents were now having to support their students at home. And so we have a mixed method study that all of my raised bees came just in time to help that first fall. And then we already have a practitioner article out explaining kind of what we did. And so now we are thankfully back into the IES grant and implementing all that we've learned from these various pieces, things that work and things that don't work. So that was a lot of information on my math work, especially if you're not in math. I hope you were able, or in single case, that you were able to kind of follow those little bits. But I wanted to, I put you guys over here. I wanted to show sort of how one thing leads to another, and you don't need huge amounts necessarily. I know we all come from different disciplines and use different research methodologies, but those were using single case, qualitative, mixed methods. I've also done surveys, things without a ton of external funding to get that pilot data that you need to show that you have the expertise, that you can publish, because grant funders want to see that you'll do something with the data that you get, and that you can manage smaller amounts of money before you then take on larger amounts. So I want to open it up for questions from anybody. Thanks, Peter.
Hey, Dr. Hey, so quick question. What is the process like for you all to get like researchers into the classrooms? Because I think you'd mentioned earlier that you did more work in private schools because it was easier. Is there like an issue with getting into public schools?
Yes. So the Leon County has has windows for applying for research that is in July, August, if you want to do anything in fall, and then November, early December, if you want to do anything in winter. And the turnaround time also is long. So I know Deidre, we were stressing because she turned hers in early, and I think got approval in late October. And so sometimes it's just a matter of your timeline. And then, so once you get approval, you then are supposed to go to principals and ask principals if they are willing to let you come in, and then you can talk to teachers. So I don't follow that process. And so it's hard, like right now, like pre-pandemic, it was hard too. Current pandemic, we have not until recently been allowed actually in the classrooms. And so for a lot of what we do, that's been hard, but I figured out how, because I'm doing research in Maryland now, and I never thought I'd be doing it this far away. But the other difficult aspect is getting teachers who are willing to be the interventionist. And I feel, and I understand right now because there's a lot going on, but yeah, I haven't been able to recruit any teachers for my current project in Leon County.
Okay, follow-up question. So you mentioned that you guys did stuff with parents. What happens if you just happen to know families who would like voluntarily have you work with their children? Is that something that's an option?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, you just get
Okay.
them to sign. I mean, yes. Short answer is yes.
Okay.
And we did, so we had some local and then we had some nationwide. We recruited nationally.
Okay. I have some families I've spoken to. Like I have a family that I did swim lessons with, and I've told about this program, and they're like, "If you want someone, here you go." And I'm like, "Okay, I'll keep that in mind." I don't know what the process is. All right, that's good to know.
Especially
Thank you.
for your like pilot data or things that you're doing one-on-one, or even if you're going to be doing a larger study, if you want to try out your methods, your assessment, how long is this going to take? If you can get, our poor children are the like testers for everything, but sometimes it's better to, not do things with your own children, or they've already done it too many times that they're not a good sample. So yes, it's also okay to work with others.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. I also had a quick question. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. So obviously grant writing is a fundamental component of being a researcher. Can you describe kind of how you progressed as a grant writer from taking courses in your doc studies to now as a faculty member?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did have a grant writing class, but my grant writing class was, I would say 90% of the time was focused on writing personal prep grants. So like the OSEP grants that many of you are on, the 325Ds and 325Ks. and then I worked on the IES grant, so I kind of had to learn by looking at it. So when I came here, I took advantage of every workshop that I could go to. NCFDD has really good webinars too. They have one called The Science of Writing, which isn't a good title because it's actually about grant writing. And it talks about like the difference between writing a grant narrative versus writing a manuscript, which nobody had made explicit to me before. And I was like, oh, this is why I'm not getting funded because I'm not writing it correctly. So there is a lot of like implicit, and then it's just submitting a lot and getting feedback and then trying again and trying again. So
Okay, thank you.
What was that called? Can you say that one more time? That resource.
yeah, NCFDD, the facultydiversity.org. I'll find the actual one that I found really helpful and send it to Katie and she can send it out. They always say don't do other stuff while you're listening to those. I do. And the nice thing is you can skip around and go back and listen. But there is this one that I felt this guy, I mean, it was so transparent and clear. The other piece that I didn't mention, I guess, is collaborators. So it's good to try out collaborations and to expand into collaborations and say, but to start small, like Brie Jimenez and I publish together a lot now. We started with just one book chapter, like low stakes, and then you see, do our working styles work out? And then go from there. We didn't jump right into a study. And then we've submitted some grants that have not been funded. But now, like, we know each other and each other's working styles, because there are people that you can be friends with that you all can probably think of those people that you are friends with, but you may not want to collaborate with. Don't jump right into writing a grant with somebody. Because then what if you get it and then you're like together for 5 years? So. All right, well, it's 1 o'clock. So if I'm happy to stick around if anybody has other questions, but